So this week, for my weekly project, I decided to visit the University of Michigan Video Game Archive, play 2 games, one of which was Space Invaders and came out in 1978, the other of which was Assassin's Creed Black Flag that came out in 2013. Now, I'm going to compare and contrast the 2 video games. Now, what's different about these video games is, besides the obvious that you told us not to talk about, the graphics are obviously nicer in Black Flag. But moving beyond the surface, what's more important about what has changed in video games is the story. The story changed from Space Invaders, in which essentially there was none. You're a little block floating around on a screen, moving left and right, pressing a button, shooting little blocks that go above you. That's it. But in Assassin's Creed Black Flag, you can do a whole host of things. You climb trees, jump on enemies, fight enemies, whatever you want to do in this open world game. Now, as you play Black Flag, you progress through the story, unlocking new levels, fighting new enemies. And that takes me to what I think is the biggest differences between games that were made before the year 2000 is that they do not have a compelling story. For the most part, at least. So, I decided to look into it a little bit and figure out why some producers decided to become more creative with their video games as years went by. And I found some legal works that were written in judicial opinions. This reaches all the way back to 1982, when precedent began, where some courts began to rule that video games were not protected under the First Amendment. They said that, and I quote, in America's Best Family Showplace Corporation versus the City of New York. Now, as time went on, however, producers began to develop more and more games that were story-driven and more violent nonetheless, which takes us to the year 2002, right around the time that the split between non-campaign story games and campaign story games began. In Interactive Digital Software Association versus St. Louis County states, just like bingo, the court fails to see how video games express ideas, impressions, feelings, or information unrelated to the game itself. And then this was the precedent set for many years to come. However, video games still developed nonetheless, and as you can see, video games became more and more violent, until finally, in the year 2011, a Supreme Court decision was reached in Brown versus Entertainment Merchants Association, and the ruling states, like the protected books, plays, and movies that preceded them, video games communicate ideas, and even social messages, through many familiar literary devices such as characters, dialogue, plot, and music. And though features distinctive to the medium, such as the player's interaction with the virtual world, that suffices to confer First Amendment protection. Essentially, around the year 2002, video games were protected as forms of art under the First Amendment. Video games before the year 2000, they didn't have a compelling story. You had people walking around, pressing little buttons to shoot things, and that's all fun. But past the year 2000, you began to experience actual emotion in video games. They would make you feel things that you could not feel before the year 2000. You became sad when the players died, and not simply frustrated that you couldn't move to the next level. So games before the year 2000 cannot be seen as much of art forms as games after the year 2000.